those and hope to see elevate those in the future. We're trying to get through this and get started as quickly as possible. Our panel today includes Fred Campbell from CEI. You have the bios accessible, but Fred comes to us having been at the Wireless Bureau at the FCC, has a great deal of experience with that. Ray Gifford is now a partner at Wilkinson Barker, but before that, you may recall, was at the Progress and Freedom Foundation, my former think tank, has been in the space for a long time and has been working on the project that PFF started as to how there could actually be a consensus on reforming the Communications Act. And last but not least, Gigi Sun, President of Public Knowledge, who's always a good sport and provides good perspective on the other side on these issues. And I hope actually we'll hear a fair amount of common ground today. At least that's my goal. Danny Watson couldn't make it today, so I apologize for him dropping out. So having said that, let's get started. I told each panelist that we'd give them 30 seconds or so just to introduce their overall perspectives on tech policy, how they look at these issues, what their first principles are. So just really briefly, we should get started. Gigi, if you'd like to kick us off here.
Yeah, okay. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out on this miserable day. And actually, this is one of the few times the Capitol Visitor Center did not give me a hard time and let me straight through, so nobody knew what was going on here. So public knowledge basically thinks that there is a role for government in preserving competition and protecting consumers in the telecom and the technology space. It's not a huge role. I mean, we've actually brought lawsuits against the FCC when they've overstepped their boundaries. And the example I'm thinking of is the 2005 broadcast flag case, where the FCC was essentially telling all TV sets, TV manufacturers, and device manufacturers downstream from the TV to read and obey a series of technological protection measures in a broadcast signal. Luckily, the DC Circuit agreed with us wholeheartedly 3-0. So we don't think that authority should be unbounded, but we do think that there needs to be some government role to ensure that there is universally accessible, affordable, and reliable communications.
Hi, Fred Campbell, Competitive Enterprise Institute. I think from our perspective, the more lightly regulated wireless and internet industries are booming and doing very well. And some of the more regulated industries are struggling. I think this year is particularly interesting because I think the 10-year-old term convergence, or perhaps older term, is now actually finally coming true. We're starting to see the end of some of the older technologies and move to a very internet-centric world and hopefully an all-IP future. So we are focused on helping that transition move along and on how we can remain globally competitive in this communications industry.
Right.
I think there's a broad consensus, a bipartisan consensus, that it waxes and wanes, but that the FCC historically has been an agency that does not follow rule of law principles, is particularly subject to capture and whimsy, and that we could do better based on neutral principles of law and neutral institutions that focus on competition policy, focus on consumer protection. I don't think as a network industry that you can have a kind of purely private actor Valhalla happen. Too many problems tend to break out, so we probably are going to have a regulatory structure around it. And I think the key, and I think the consensus, is that a neutral rule of law regulator is to be preferred to a non-neutral, unpredictable regulator. And that sounds very generic and a little bit goo-goo, but it's really not a bad place to start.
Well, so indeed, that is sort of the basis of our hope to go today, which is how are we going to see changes across the board in tech policy in the next few years, and what would a neutral and fair regulator that actually abides by the rule of law look like. But before we start unpacking why the FCC is not that regulator, so I'm sure we can all agree, just broadly speaking, what each of you think will be the top 3 to 5 issues over the next few years? And what do you think there's actually a consensus that you can see some action happen, and which do you think will be really just intractable issues?
So I'm going to advertise the public knowledge blog and blog post that my Senior Vice President, Harold Feld, put up just today about the switch to an all-IP network. Some of you may have known that last week or the week before, AT&T announced that it was going to increase its investment in both its wireline and wireless networks by $14 billion over the last 2 years, which we cheered. At the same time, they asked the FCC for some preliminary regulatory, or at least at the beginning of a discussion about what should the regulatory landscape look like when we go to an all-IP network, because that's where everybody wants to go. Everybody, people don't want to continue with their legacy plain old telephone service. They want to go to an all-IP network, and that's understandable, and that's actually a good thing. But when the plain old telephone service, or POTS, is retired, the copper network is retired, then along with it goes a lot of the sort of regulatory structure that has existed since 1934. So the question that arises, and he says it's the number one telecom question, and I tend to agree with him, is how do we ensure that we have a universally accessible, reliable, and affordable network? It's the 100-year anniversary of the so-called Kingsbury Commitment, where AT&T, which was the monopoly at the time, promised that very kind of network. So I think that the time is ripe to talk about, in the all-IP world, how we preserve that. That's number one. Number two, I'm not going to, he doesn't want me to mention copyright, so I won't, if you want to talk about that.
Let's not get stuck in the morass.
The future of video. How do we get to a world where everybody can watch the TV they want to watch on the device they want to watch it on, at the time they want to watch it? Right now, legacy regulations prevent that from happening, and a lack of will by regulators have prevented that from happening. And I think, and also lack of will by some of the industries not making their content available for people to purchase. So what happens, they end up stealing it. So I think there's a lot of work there. I think there's a lot of bipartisan support for that. And then I think the third thing from my perspective, obviously spectrum is big, but there are many proceedings going down the pipeline. And the fourth thing is I think the time is ripe for copyright reform. We had a big battle over soap and pepper last year, and I think there may not be 14 million people advocating for copyright reform, but I think we have those of us that think that it's time to bring more balance back into the copyright equation. We have a lot more friends on the Hill than we had a year ago. So I think you're going to see some serious efforts. In fact, I just heard that Congressman Ice is going to introduce a bill that would allow you to rip the DVDs that you own to put them on the device that you own. That is, according to the Copyright Office, is not a thing that you can do legally.
So let's unpack those, but just top issues before we get into details here.
Well, I actually largely agree with Gigi about the issues that are going to be important in the coming year. I think it's all driven by internet transformation, which is a term the FCC used and I've started to use to talk about the ways in which IP interconnected networks are breaking down the traditional regulatory barriers, and it raises all of the issues I think Gigi spoke about. I definitely think the transition to all IP networks will be very big this year. We did a digital transition for TV. We've transitioned the wireless devices to digital, and by that IP broadband-based digital. And it's time to look at the switch telephone network and figure out how to transition it as well. And I do think there's a consensus around that. I did a blog post this morning as well, but mine made just the fundamental point that I think I was amazed that I believe we have a bipartisan consensus that it's time to figure out how to make that happen. And I think Harold's went into more detail on the issues. But the fact that we have a consensus means that it's time to do that transition is, I think, means it's going to be an important issue this year. I think the video continues to be an important issue. Just like we have a Communications Act for traditional telecommunications that is centered around a particular type of network, which is now hopelessly outdated. Our video regulations assume certain things about a broadcast model and a cable model, and the internet is transforming those things as well. So it's another important issue. Spectrum will be an important issue. As G.E. said, there's actually big proceeding underway, but that will be, the details of that will be a big focus to many. And I would also just add, I think cybersecurity could be an important issue this year. It was worked on a lot last year. I think it's important to this administration, and I don't know how that will go, but I do expect we'll see some discussion about that in 2013 as well.
Right. Well, let me kind of question your premise, if I might, Baron. Not that I disagree with any of the topics and the issues that are going to be hot. However, what I do question is how we tend to think about these issues in a framework as these one-off muddling through issues based on a legacy regulatory model. And if we talk about the future of the PSTN, what we're talking about is how do we deal with kind of Title II common carrier notions that are still embedded back there in the mists of our voice traffic that has some social values that we want to carry forward, or not, as the case may be, and how do we muddle through that? If we reconceptualize all of these questions, the video question, the future of the PSTN question, as neutral legal questions of how that you conceptualize through the lens of competition policy. First of all, they all become coherent and connected. The video competition analytic issues are the same as the PSTN analytic issues in terms of how do the competitive pressures or lack of competitive pressures in these markets create enhanced consumer welfare, or where is it impeded? So it sounds a little bit esoteric, but if we try and reconceptualize these issues not as one-offs based on our legacy systems, where we're talking about video under the legacy video regulations and the future of the PSTN under the legacy telecom regulations, then it at least becomes a more clear, mutually coherent set of issues that we're facing going forward into an all-IP internet world where the video, the voice, and the data are all running on the same pipe over the same protocols.
So let's start there, and this is exactly where I wanted to go with this conversation. As everyone here knows, the D.C. Circuit will rule next year, probably by June, on the FCC's approach to net neutrality. Ray, do you think that decision could actually prompt the kind of reconceptualization that you're talking about?
I think that's the decision that will possibly, if not probably, given that I would expect the D.C. Circuit will overturn the FCC, that will kind of recatalyze interest in this area, because the progressive side of the world will be faced with the fact that the FCC either did it wrong or doesn't have the power to do it in the first place. And they have, that may create legislative impetus on that side. And I think there remains, it's not an embroil, but there a similar consensus that reconceptualizing the way we approach communications law is a worthwhile endeavor, and not as a series of necessarily one-off small bore proposals, but as a broad neutral reconceptualization.
I think that's a great as a concept, but I think the reality is I don't see this Congress, which is, not a whole lot different than the Congress we had before, and there'll be about a month of kumbaya, and then they'll be back to business. I just don't see them doing anything that big. Okay, you do have some in Congress who would like to strip the FCC, and the net neutrality case could be sort of the factor that gets that moving, would like to strip the FCC of all authority over broadband. And then there are others in Congress who will never allow that to happen. So I don't know, I'm just not sure if the next Congress is going to be capable of something all that big. And I do think, even more than the net neutrality case, obviously the net neutrality case, if it goes the way Ray thinks it will, and I have, unfortunately, even though my organization is defending the FCC, I think it's going to be a very, very tough road to hoe for the DC Circuit to go the way we'd like it to go. I just don't see Congress fixing it. I think it's going to really take either a very strong FCC chair, who's going to have to reinstate the authority, or it's going to take the kind of conversations that I think are going to come up around the AT&T filing and the move to an all-IP network to talk about what the next Kingsbury commitment is going to look like. So I just, as much as I'd like to see Congress, do a big think around, what does communications law look like in an all-IP world, and a world where the FCC has very little authority over broadband. I just don't see it really happening. I think the best we might hope for are chipping away, for instance, on some of the video issues.
And I don't disagree, Gigi. I think the big thing takes time, but we might as well start.
So before we talk about the politics here, let's just talk about the law for just a moment here. So what do you think is the most likely outcome specifically of the decision? And to put the question most pointedly, what options do you think will remain to the FCC?
Well, I think there'll be a legislative attempt to try to give the FCC limited authority and reinstate the rules. I don't think that will succeed.
So let's assume that you're right, that the real hypothesis here is that nothing's going to get through in the Congress. So absent a legislative change, the situation on the ground after the DC Circuit rules, do you see any authority remaining to the FCC here, or do you think that we will revert to the status quo that the FTC, the position the FTC took in 2007 under Chairman Majoris, where they issued a very lengthy report explaining their legal analysis as to why they think they already have jurisdiction to enforce both the antitrust laws and consumer protection laws under Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act over broadband?
So I have to also remind people that the FCC's authority is being challenged in two other cases, and a lot also depends on what happens there. So the first case, which has already been heard, oral arguments already been had in the DC Circuit, challenges the FCC's data roaming rules, which are the rules that essentially require dominant wireless providers to enter into roaming agreements with their smaller competitors so their customers can roam on their data networks. The third case is and that case is in the DC Circuit, so the same court that is hearing the net neutrality case, and is traditionally very, very hostile to the FCC. And that's why we brought our broadcast phone case there. The third case involves the switch of universal service to broadband, from plain telephone service to broadband. That's in the 10th Circuit in Denver. So, I mean, the net neutrality case is not necessarily going to be the be-all, end-all on FCC authority. It's possible the FCC could have sort of like a Swiss cheese of authority to do some things with regard to broadband and lack of authority to do other things. So, I think it's a little too early to say that the net neutrality decision is going to be the be-all, end-all, although, it could strip the FCC of a lot of its ability to protect consumers. Look, I think it's all up to who the next FCC chair is. This chair has been disinclined to retain the authority, bring back the authority that the agency had before 2002.
You mean through reclassification?
Yeah, through classification, yes. And that if Congress does not act, it really depends on what that chair, wants to do.
And I'm going to echo a little bit of that. I'm not sure that the current cases that are pending regarding the FCC's broadband jurisdiction are going to be the be-all, end-all. Either, even if those cases would go against the FCC, I think there are larger issues and areas where the FCC has the authority to act that can help us along with this internet transformation, irrespective of what happens in those cases. And so, for example, going to the need to transition to all IP networks and do away with the old 1930s to 1960s switched telephone network technologies, which are a drain on dead weight loss on the economy, in my view, maintaining those because the regulations require it. You take the voice over internet protocol, and the FCC has there's 911 obligations that apply to those and access by law enforcement and the like that were done without even classifying it, and they haven't really been challenged in court. And so, in other words, some of those basic social obligations already apply to VoIP insofar as the FCC is concerned, and haven't been challenged in court and presumably would be unchanged or unfettered by anything the D.C. Circuit does in these other cases, which leaves the issue of legacy economic regulations that are holding back our transition to an all-IP internet future. So I think, I don't want to say these cases aren't important, but I would echo the view that they are not the necessarily the end of the FCC's role here, and things that need to happen going forward that can be tackled in 2013.
Well, since we're talking about cases, let's just talk about one other case, City of Arlington. Any want to comment on that, Ray?
There is a case. City of Arlington was accepted by, on petition for cert by the Supreme Court. That's going to presumably, or at least the issue on which cert was granted, is determine whether or not Chevron deference applies to agency jurisdiction. It's not a communications law specific issue. Chevron deference applies to most agencies.
And that would mean that the courts would defer to the agency's own interpretations of substantive outcomes, but as to questions of whether the FCC itself has jurisdiction.
Yes, if Chevron deference applies, yes, the courts would defer to agency decisions regarding the extent of their jurisdiction. If it doesn't, those would be determined as a matter of law, if you will.
So Gigi's shaking her head here. I'm conflicted about this.
No, I'm not conflicted. I mean, this was the key to our. I mean, I hate bringing up a victory that we had 7 years ago, but it was a pretty considerable case where the FCC was trying to regulate devices after a communication had taken place, okay? And they alleged that there was Chevron deference over their determination that they had jurisdiction. And the D.C. Circuit said, no way, no how. You do not. That is a baseline question. You don't even get to Chevron. You don't get to Chevron before you get to the question of whether you have jurisdiction. And reversing that decision would make me very, very nervous if an agency's determination that it had jurisdiction, I mean, the sort of baseline authority to decide a matter was subject to Chevron deference, because the courts tend to give an awful lot of deference under Chevron.
So the part is, we tend to agree with you on that, and go ahead, Baron.
Well, is it fair to say here, Gigi, just to try to bring into to sharp relief the differences, but also the common ground here on the panel, is it fair to say that you would tend to think in some circumstances the agency ought to have more jurisdiction, but they should not be the master of its own, of the bounds of its own authority?
I mean, that's what Congress gives to it. It should not have the ability to essentially overrule the power that Congress gave to it.
So then that would be a plea, I assume, to have Congress ultimately decide these difficult questions that are increasingly being raised rather than leaving them to the agency.
Look, yes, I agree. I really do wish that the FCC's authority over broadband was clearer. And Second Communications Act itself, I am dismayed and disappointed that since 1998, both Democratic and Republican chairs have seen fit to essentially give up his authority over broadband. This is the thing that just shocks the living daylights out of me, is, look, Republicans or sort of more free market types, they may not use their authority, but they don't tend to just give it away. And the FCC is sort of, singularly is unique in the fact that both Democrats and Republican chairs have just sort of given away its authority to protect consumers when it comes to broadband.
But Gigi, if I could push back a little.
Sure.
What PK and other groups did on the broadcast flag and are very wary of, and I think rightfully wary of, is the mission creep that tempts the FCC, largely through industry pressure, surprise, surprise, that is going to have them expand their jurisdiction over things they don't have jurisdiction over, and to create a regulatory system that becomes a handmaiden of specific interests. The abnegation by the FCC of authority in some generic sense over broadband is guarding against that same mission creep. And the telecom wars of 96 to 2004 were largely a wrestling match over a vision of synthetic competition between different interests in the industry to divide rents. The consumer welfare benefits to the competitive model that emerged out of the 96 Act were illusory at best, and so it seems to me that prudentially for the FCC to deny itself whatever generic, so we're not going there, we're just going to let this thing go, has been almost completely salutary and would only be damaged by them saying, except here where we might want to do something absent a very clear showing of consumer welfare harm.
Well, I might not agree with you about whether the 1996 Act worked or not. It worked for a short time, and it worked in a way that was extremely salutary to consumers. I mean, when we were in the dial-up world, each American had a choice of 13 dial-up ISPs. Now we live in a world where you have, essentially a wireline monopoly, or maybe if you're lucky a duopoly, and then you've got two very strong wireless companies and two pretty weak ones. So I don't think that the 96 Act ended up not working because the FCC basically allowed for enormous consolidation and got rid of the policies that are now adopted in Europe and elsewhere, where they have many different choices for consumers. So I'm not sure I necessarily agree with you sort of on that historical perspective, but again, it gets back to, it's one thing not to exercise your power, okay? But it's another one to just sort of like throw it away in the dustbin of history. So if you actually want to use it, let's say for public safety reasons or for universal service reasons or to protect the disabled, you're going to be challenged in court because you gave it away. I mean, this is what Scalia, and I don't want to get too legalistic, but go back and read his wonderful dissent. You can write it down. Gigi Son, praises Justice Scalia. Wonderful dissent in the Brand X case. I mean, he predicted this. He predicted an agency without any ability to protect consumers or promote competition in a broadband world. And, it's a brilliant and, frankly, like I said, prescient dissent.
I actually slightly disagree anyway on the historical characterization of the 1996, and I think technology passed it by. I don't think the Act expected to see the types of differing networks providing the same types of services that IP enabled. That's why it thought we're going to have this telephone network, and that's where all the competition will occur. And I think what really happened, irrespective of what the regulator did, is that you now have wireless networks that can provide essentially the same services. You have, hopefully multiple wireline networks that can provide these services. You have, the ability to access Wi-Fi through a number of providers at airports and all kinds of just market developments that weren't foreseen, which I like to call it internet transformation, whatever you call it. I think it's sort of passed the Act by, and that's the questions that now we have to struggle with. Is if that's true, if it's passed by, then what do we do going forward? But I just, clear. I
think you're right, but let's also remember that the regulatory construct of the 96 Act caused hundreds of billions of dollars worth of malinvestment for about a 10-year period, because the market signals and the kind of rights that and the incentives to invest were completely distorted by our regulatory default rules.
Okay, so let's not spend too much time on history.
So blame the government for the foolish actions in the marketplace. That's
probably the first time that's happened.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
But so let's talk about this. So Gigi, it sounds like your fundamental concern here is that there has to be some vehicle for protecting consumers and for taming market power. Well, at PFF, you ran a project that was intended to deal with exactly those two problems and to come up with a consensus solution for how we might reconceptualize the FCC along those lines. Would you tell us about the DACA project and what it's become today?
Yeah, well, first of all, it would be grandiose of me to say I ran it. It was a collective group effort. Kyle Dixon, who's here, helped run it, and Randy May and a lot of great folks. But what we did is we got a bipartisan group of scholars together from think tanks, from academia. It actually ended up a plurality of the folks who participated in the working groups were from the Democratic side of the aisle, and said, how can we reconceptualize a communications law for the 21st century was the conceit. And not wanting to completely reinvent the wheel, but we looked at different sorts of models which have some merit. Things like the Staggers Act, which is how we deal with railroads in the early 1980s, and how you handle the market power problems in railroads, which is a model that I think has some merit. The one we settled on was a Federal Trade Commission Act model, and it did the two things, at least purported at a very general level, what Gigi mentioned, which is it is there to protect against unfair competition and allow for consumer protection where it can be proven. I think the keystone of it were two institutional kind of modifications to the way the FCC does business now. First of all, it took away most of the prospective rulemaking authority, which is mainly how the FCC acts now, and replaced it with post hoc adjudicatory methods, where, like at the Federal Trade Commission, if the Commission is going to act, it has to go in front of an ALJ, or in some cases in front of a court, and prove that market power has been abused and that consumers have been harmed. So instead of what is a traditionally very untransparent and opaque prospective rulemaking model, you end up with a public adjudicated model that is still focusing on what are progressive era statute values and language of unfair competition and consumer protection.
So that was the Digital Age Communications Act that Senator DeMint in 2006 introduced. Very briefly, where does that stand today?
And not to monopolize it here, a few of the band have gotten back together and have been talking about what would you do differently, what did we learn now, and I still think the fundamental model of the Federal Trade Commission Act holds with limited use of prospective rulemaking. The one addition, and Gigi, I hope can speak, if not glowingly, at least hopefully about this, is using multi-stakeholder models. That the UK in about 2003 passed the New Communications Act and explicitly authorizing what they call co- and self-regulatory bodies to kind of intermediate between what is kind of sovereign action of the state and the frictions that break out in the network industry, let's just treat them generically like that, And the multi-stakeholder bodies, the best example that we have around Washington is BTAG, which Gigi is the chair of, which explain is, I'll let Gigi explain. She's the chair.
So the BTAG is the Broadband Internet Technology Advisory Group, and what it is set up to do is essentially examine network management practices to determine whether they're reasonable enough or not. So this comes out of the FCC's network neutrality rules, which says that, particularly for wireline, you can't, block or discriminate against a particular application, service, or content. But the exception to that rule is reasonable network management, to ensure essentially the reasonable and efficient running of one's network. So the BTAG consists of a board, of which I am one of the co-chairs, and which is made up of folks from all different industries and public interest. And then a technology advisory group, which is open to anyone who will pay, I don't think, a particularly unreasonable sum. And they look at network management practices and determine, what are best practices and what are not. So it's been around for 2 years now. We just have a new executive director, Doug Sicker, and that's worked very, very well so far.
So had I been thinking about this, I would have sat right between Fred and Gigi, because in a way here, actually we have an opportunity to hear both from the left and the right, if you will, what people think about, two experts think about that compromise proposal that was describing there, which, as I said, was very much the product of his work with a number of others who I think are very well respected by folks that Gigi would probably tell you more to agree with. So I'd be curious to hear from each of you, Fred and Gigi. What do you think of this sort of approach, such as what is laid out? Gigi, if you'd like to start?
So I do think the multi-stakeholder model is good for a lot of things, but the problem I have with it in DACA is that it is the primary way of making policy, and that there's no backstop. In fact, it's specifically in here says that there's no government backstop for any multi-stakeholder decision making. That makes me nervous. The other thing that makes me nervous, and the imperfections with multi-stakeholder governance, that there's no provision in here that makes sure that groups like mine actually are represented at the table, and that they have the means to be represented at the table. And two of my attorneys are going to Dubai as part of the U.S. delegation, and we're supporting the multi-stakeholder model there. But for groups like mine can't do this on any regular basis. We just don't have the resources. Can't fly literally on all over the world. And frankly, when you talk about in the international context, developing countries don't have it. So there needs to be a protection to make sure that the public is actually represented. And the multi-stakeholder model that works for me still has a backstop if agreement cannot be had.
Very quick response.
Yeah, no, I think Gigi's right. And I think you can look at different sorts of models. One of them, and this is the UK's Communications Act language, is co-regulatory, that has a government backstop behind it, or self-regulatory is their language that does not.
And let's be clear, when we're talking about backstop, we're not talking about enforcement of the self-regulatory code. We're talking about if the code doesn't produce a good enough system of having government step in and regulate.
Yes.
Right. And I think I think Gigi's points are well taken. The challenges that come to kind of multi-stakeholder organizations are, one, they're not broadly representative enough. And you do have a problem, and we talked about it a lot during BTAG, and Gigi knows, is how do you account for the innovator who isn't there? Right, the person by definition who isn't in the room because you don't know who they are yet or who they look like. The idea or the conceit, I think, of the multi-stakeholder processes are the magic bullet. They don't take care of everything. You just go away and forget about it. A lot of them, I think, depends on the culture that evolves within the entity itself. The multi-stakeholder entity itself, but you can adapt them to meet different kind of competition policy or consumer needs. in ways that I think that could accommodate the concerns, perhaps accommodate some of the concerns that Gigi just expressed.
Yeah, I would like to say a couple of things, actually. I think there are advantages to whatever that Latin term is for looking at it after the fact. What is that term again? Ex post. Ex post. Yeah, see, that's why, exactly. Thank you, because the Latin kills me. There are advantages to that, because, you know, the risk you run with prophylactic regulation is not allowing some new ideas to develop that might otherwise develop. People tend to conform themselves to regulation. Then the second problem is once folks have conformed themselves to regulation, businesses, they then have a business model premised on that particular scenario. That's what makes these transition issues so difficult. The digital TV transition and the wireless transition, there were companies who had premised their model on a regulation, and so when the government says, well, it's time to change that regulation, they've always got that, you know, sort of argument about, wait a second, and so it can lead to stagnation, so there are advantages to that. On the other hand, some of these things, you know, can be issue specific. And then, you know, there are certain things, you take E911, I think there's a bipartisan, or has been for a long time, a consensus around that. It applies to VoIP for that reason. And, you know, there may be a role there because part of that system is run by governmental entities, and so it takes some coordination between government, industry, and the like. You could do it through a multi-stakeholder model. I guess what I'm suggesting is there's sort of a post hoc enforcement function that can work very well for competitive issues where you want to maximize business model innovation and the like, and then maybe you use some different models like multi-stakeholder for something like E911, and how are we going to interconnect with the public safety answering points. I guess I wanted to be almost a mediator here in the sense that I think there are various reasons to use different models depending on what the circumstances.
Yeah, and some of the difficulty here that you raised, Fred, is issues of regulatory backward compatibility, right? It's a frequent technological problem that tech companies face, is how am I going to be backward compatible with kind of legacy structures, right? My kids, my youngest is just crestfallen at his old Wii, the new Wii won't run his old Wii games, and he's making that very tough decision in the mind of a 7-year-old of, do I abandon my existing platform?
He didn't get the Wii transition check?
But that would be the point, right? Which is what regulation often does, is has to wrestle with the backward compatibility of its old regulation. 911 is a great flashpoint for that, where it's not easy when we've got something that everyone identifies as a public good that is premised on a 1960s, you know, network architecture and set of signaling systems, that you can either invest enormous sums of money to make the internet part backward compatible to the old system, or you can, you know, scrap it and start anew. I think the same principles apply to regulation here, which is why emerging kind of categorically from old legacy regulations to a new framework is, you got to tear off the Band-Aid.
I just want to make abundantly clear that, I mean, I'm uncomfortable with a lot of things in DACA. I mean, you know, the Federal Trade Act is very, very narrow in its scope. I also wonder, you know, why are you essentially giving the FCC, you know, the same powers as the FTC? Why not just let the FTC regulate, you know, enforce in this area? But be that as it may, what an unfair or deceptive trade practices has been construed very narrowly. And your bill says that essentially the FCC is supposed to construe those terms pretty much the same way as the FTC does. So I don't think it doesn't get at a lot of the consumer issues that we work with every day. I'm uncomfortable, you know, with the standard for denying license transfers. I think it would essentially lead to pretty much every single license transfer being granted. And you basically have lowered or raised the bar so much on showing that a license transfer isn't in the public interest that, like I said, every single one would be granted. So I like multi-stakeholderism. I think it has a role, but there are other things in this bill that make it really clear that I'm not enormously comfortable with. This is not to say that I think that the commission is perfect. I've got, my organization for several years now has structural changes that we'd like to see made, including changing the sunshine laws and other stuff which I can get into if people want to hear about it. But I just think this bill would really, really limit the kind of things that the FCC could do. Like it would be, I know you're concerned about mission creep. I'm concerned about mission creep, but I think it would leave it with very little ability again to deal with things like public safety, the hearing impaired, universal access, and things like that. So
I want to get back to what's going to happen in this next Congress, what actually could happen, but just please, briefly, any response to Gigi's concerns?
Getting back to kind of neutral rule of law principles is where we need to start, and I think we agree on that. And the FCC reform project that Public Knowledge did with Silicon Flatirons, there's a lot of overlap and agreement with kind of the historic inherent lawlessness to the way the FCC does business. Things like unfair competition and consumer protection through the FTC and through the Department of Justice and the antitrust doctrine have evolved to where there is a Harvard School view of antitrust and there is a Chicago School view of antitrust. There is a legal argument between people on a neutral playing field where we agree about principles. We may not agree about outcomes. We may not agree about whether a given practice in the market is going to be harmful or not. But we're speaking the same neutral language of law, and if it comes out one way or the other, I at least understand why that is and what sort of principles a person is applying. I think that in and of itself is a monumental leap forward from the system we have now, which is a series of one-offs from a very murky common carriage past of a law that was written for a monopoly.
And for my part, let me just add here, and we'll talk about this in a future roundtable, but in a way I share to some extent Gigi's concern, because the situation that I just described is true in antitrust, where we have developed a great deal of analytical rigor, and there are schools on both sides that would take different opinions. On the consumer protection side of things, and this has become more of my focus over the last few years, and especially in privacy, I'm sorry to say that that's really has not been the case, and I think it could be the case, but I think it hasn't happened primarily because on the antitrust side of things, the FTC and the DOJ are frequently challenged in court, and there has arisen this, I think, really great doctrinal evolution because the courts check the agencies. The agencies have to justify themselves in court, and the Academy has gotten involved to explain how they think the very terse language of the Clayton-Sherman Acts should be developed. However, on the side of pure consumer protection cases under Section 5, you have language that I think, if anything, is that there's more to it to start with. Unfair and deceptive trade practices. The FTC in 1980 and 1983 issued their policy statements which give that meaning, and the unfairness policy statement was subsequently codified, so it's actually not part of the FTC Act. The problem is, and this is where I think I do to an extent agree with you, but where I'm perhaps more optimistic, the problem is that in those cases, and particularly here in privacy, the FTC is never challenged. Companies never sued. The Wyndham case that's currently pending, to my knowledge, is perhaps the second, but maybe the first, depending on the account. Privacy or data security case where the FTC has actually gone to court. And so because of that, the FTC really hasn't built doctrine. It has essentially just said in each of its cases, here's what happened. We think the filing was unfair, and there hasn't been a lot of analysis to that. So I would say to Gigi that to the extent that we're moving towards that sort of a model for consumer protection, I would absolutely agree that it only works if it is actually something more like a common law model, which is where an agency has to explain its analysis. And there is some, to get to Ray's point, there is some independent neutral arbiter that actually decides whether legal standards have been met. And over time, you have a clear sense, okay, what is a substantial injury to consumers? What is a countervailing benefit? And how can consumers actually avoid it? That would be true on privacy. It would also be true on the sorts of billing issues that the FCC currently deals with, and many of the consumer protection issues that I think Gigi would find concerning. So that's just a way of saying that I'd like to see Ray's vision come true when we have a rule of law playing field where we actually hash out these issues, and we might disagree about what the standards end up being, but at least we could agree that that would be a better world to live in than a world where we deal with problems prophylactically in creating rules that don't necessarily make sense over time, and where the agency ends up being fairly prone to capture by special interests that can steal regulations. So I want to turn from this conversation to talk about some actual case studies, and again, as I said, things that might actually happen in this Congress. So the actions that I see on the table are, one, to get to the specific issue we've just been talking about, the concern that's been raised for several years now that having the FCC deal with consumer proprietary network information, CPI rules or privacy rules, doesn't make any sense, and moving those to the FTC. Two is process reform. The House passed legislation in that last Congress. Three is AT&T has just announced they want to end their copper public switch telephone network system, move to all fiber. And four, to wrap this conversation up, would be the competition reform. So those four areas seem to me to be areas where something's going to happen. And I'd like to hear what the panel thinks of it. So, Fred, you've been left out here. Do you want to start by talking about AT&T?
Sure. Well, I think we'd already sort of come to consensus that that's going to happen. I mean, the switch telephone network cannot go on rationally.
What does it mean for the FCC's authority?
Yeah, the FCC right now, there are a number of requirements in Title II that apply uniquely to companies that operate switched telephone networks and actually require them to operate them, which is the problem. Because I think everybody now realizes we need to go to an internet future, but we're requiring companies, and it's a subset of companies involved in the market, to maintain an outdated technology, duplicative network, additional costs, additional engineers. I think we've come to the consensus that that needs to go away. What that means for the FCC authority, I mean, I think I would say they have the power to there's a couple different procedural avenues, but forbear from some of those regulations and the like. I use VoIP as an example of a way that they've dealt with some of this, where it's a service they really haven't classified as a traditional telecommunication service subject to these switched network rules, and yet they've applied a number of obligations to it where there's bipartisan consensus, like E911. And I think that kind of approach could continue to work.
So, Fred, why should those rules go away? Gigi has mentioned the concern that we're heading to a wireline monopoly or duopoly. That's certainly been the focus of people like Tim Lee and Susan Crawford. Do you think that these two issues intersect, that these old regulations are in some sense actually making that cable monopoly more likely?
Well, yeah, I think they actually inhibit competition too. There is a theory out there that cable is establishing a monopoly. And to the extent we require one of the potential wireline competitors to, waste money in a deadweight loss on an unnecessary network, potentially you're derailing that. A potential competitor to that. But I think where there's an intersection and not an intersection, the non-intersection is we've got a whole set of rules that apply only to one set or type of company that were based on the idea that those companies were dominant in a particular network type. And that network type is serving, 30% and dropping rapidly. It varies a little bit by region, but not that many folks are using the traditional wireline telephone, yet we're maintaining the switches to provide service to those wireline telephones based on regulatory fiat from a different era. Yeah, the point is if we're going to go to an all-IP world, we need to figure out how to subject IP networks to the same to the same competitive environment.
Right? Yeah, I mean, I think we said this at the very beginning. I mean, it's time to rethink the Kingsbury commitment. If we're going all IP network, we have consensus that that's a good thing. But obviously, it does undermine what remaining authority the FCC may have left after, the courts are done with it. That we need to figure out how we ensure, and I know I'm sounding, repetitive, universally available, affordable, and reliable network. Look, I just found out last night my childhood home was wiped out by Hurricane Sandy. And people were searching for payphones to try to make phone calls because understandably the wireless networks were down and their houses have been wiped out and their phones weren't working. So how do we make sure that people have reliable phone service in an all-IP world? I'm not saying you should have to continue providing POTS, but it's one of sort of the backstop things I think is sort of the essence of what we want government to do. And I know AT&T is saying that when they're done with their investment, 99% of the country will be covered. That's fantastic, but 1% is still millions of people.
You heard it here. Gigi Sun cares about the 1%.
No, and to pick up on the point Fred was making, and I think he's exactly right. Although pretty soon, the next wave that we're going to hear is it's going to be the end of the world as we know it, because there are business models that are premised on rights that are gained under Title II, right? Interconnection rights, special, and ironically, of course, the FCC on special access is going the exact opposite direction of letting the new IP world go. They're looking to go back and regulate it. So the problem of this transition is going to be real because there are reliance interests that are premised on a legal stature and status that comes from being on that old circuit switch network. And how do you translate that in a way to an IP network where I don't think interconnection going forward is going to be a big deal. But you can see how denial of interconnection in a specific instance can become a problem.
And you should mention that your bill that you're working on actually does have a section dealing with interconnection.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you can think about how you want to deal with interconnection, and I'm probably as sanguine as Fred on how things like that would work out in a marketplace going forward, but realize that transition is going to be hard, again, because there are going to be folks who want backward compatibility to Title II interconnection rights and leasing rights.
I want to actually seize on something I think Gigi said, and you can correct me if you're wrong, because I've been
You mean if you're wrong? Not if she's wrong.
I've been a proponent of this for some time, which is, if universal service is an issue, the answer is not requiring the continuation of an outdated network. Let's come up with an explicit subsidy to solve the problem. And
Exactly right.
And I think that's what you're saying. And I would agree with that. Now, I will tell you that there are folks, of the free market persuasion that would say, folks shouldn't be living there.
They should move.
But look,
Are you saying that Robert Redford's ranch is not going to get subsidies for universal service?
To be honest, I think there's some bipartisan consensus around universal service, and one of the reasons is context. This country for 100 years encouraged people to live in rural areas. We gave away land under the Homestead Act, and we did rural electrification and the like. So the reality is, you may hear from the points Ray mentioned, some folks say, well, this is going to leave rural America behind, and like, and my view is, let's now wait a second, and I think it's what Chief said, let's figure out how to solve those issues without, throwing the baby out with the bathwater by keeping around some ancient technology.
Okay,
that's not a very...
I don't move on before we turn the questions from the audience. I just want to cover these other issues, but it sounds like there's a certain consensus there that where there's a market failure, that's where we should be focused on. So it's something to talk about video competition reform. So there is actually a bill now, Senator to me, Chris Scalise had a video competition reform bill. Gigi, before I need you to comment on this, but just maybe you want to just very briefly explain the gist of the bill, and that could be you, Gigi, if you like.
I don't know every single detail, but basically we get rid of a lot of the legacy regulations that protect broadcasters, also some that protect cablecasters and satellite. with also with media ownership regulations. I mean, I think the idea is just to make it a more level playing field when it comes to video competition. So it would get rid of retransmission consent, must carry, distant signal protections, the compulsory license, am I right, Fernando? Get rid of the compulsory license, which cablecasters and satellite providers take advantage of, and it would lift the media ownership regulations.
So what do you think?
Well, I like it other than the media ownership part.
Okay, I mean, so let's assume, take that out.
That will probably be taken out, yeah.
What do you think of the rest of the bill?
I think it's a really good start. I mean, it just, I just don't see any particular, like I said, I'm all for the consumer being able to watch what they want to watch on the device they want to watch it on, the time they want to watch it. Okay, that's the only thing that's missing from that bill, in my opinion, is you can call it the all-of-them fix, or the ability of the consumer to attach any device to a cable network. That to me is the only thing that's missing from that bill. But there's no good policy or other reason to continue to protect broadcasters either through retransmission consent, must carry, or the distant signal protections. I just don't see it. In this day and age, I don't understand why we need that anymore. And a compulsory license is sort of the flip side of that.
And just to be clear, when you say in this day and age, why don't we need this anymore, what do you mean? How has the marketplace changed? What does this story tell us about?
Well, no, I mean, do people know that they're watching a broadcast station over a cable channel? I mean, people don't know anymore. It's all the same to them. Cable has its own local channels as well. Look, the basis of the protections that broadcasters got was that they were supposed to be so-called fiduciaries for the public, and they were supposed to, carry local programming. And other than weather and, sports, they really don't do that. I mean, they get free spectrum. And they really don't keep up their end of the bargain. So I'm not sure, I'm not even sure I'd even want that bargain this day and age, but just assuming that we think that bargain is solid, they certainly haven't kept up with that part of the bargain, and there's no reason why they should get mandated protection or mandated carriage on cable systems, why they should get protection from competition. If I could just say one other thing, I remember we supported, people say, oh, you're against everything. Well, we supported the merger of XM and Sirius. And one of the things that Sirius wanted to do, or XM wanted to do, which one was they wanted to carry local radio stations, and they wanted to carry their own local content. And the broadcasters went absolutely nuts about it. And one of the things that happened in the merger was they were prevented from carrying any local content. Why should that be? Why shouldn't broadcasters have to actually compete in the sort of local marketplace? I mean, that to me is the essence of being any competitive.
Fred?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a lot of good things in that bill as well, and moving towards a more market-based approach for video program makes a ton of sense. The FCC recently allowed the per se prohibition on some of the program access rules to expire, and I thought it was a good thing because, again, based on history, there was an assumption when that was originally enacted that there's one sort of network at the time, cable. That was I think that was enacted, prior to the launch of the first DirecTV satellite, and that's not the world that we have anymore. But what happens when there's a regulation that gives you sort of a government right to certain programming is maybe we're disincentivizing others to, I pointed out in a blog post where maybe Verizon and AT&T would be producing more programming for their own video distribution networks, except, well, hey, we have a regulated right to everyone else's. I'm now a little bit more on the MVPD and that type of video programming than the broadcast, but the broadcast situation is going to Gigi's point is, about 10% get their programming over the year now, and a lot of those regulatory structures in place probably don't make a lot of sense.
Any comment here on the tennis channel case and how it intersects with this bill? We can move on. The FCC, as you know, has been sued about its intervention in the programming marketplace by regarding the tennis channel's placement on a preferential tier. But let's move on. We can take more questions about that if anybody's interested. Just to wrap things up here before we turn to questions from the audience, any final comment on those other two areas I laid out as experiments or areas where we might actually see something happen here? Again, being the potential for, if Gigi's right, that it's not possible for something big to move this Congress. We talked about video competition reform. What about targeted legislation that could either deal with the issue of CP&I and make the FTC really a fully fledged data protection authority to have jurisdiction over that instead of the FCC? And then what about finally the problem that we've been dancing around, which is FCC process reform? House passed a bill last Congress that they actually would have done that. Public knowledge has come out in the past and endorsed a different package with some overlap of process reforms. Could those two areas be areas where we actually see some sort of legislative movement? Right?
I suppose so. FCC process reform, well, I think there's a lot of value to it, and while there may be a little bit of disagreement on the margin, I think you could probably come to a consensus. It's a little bit like rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic, though. The fundamental cultural outlook and gestalt of the agency is not going to be changed by a few rules, it seems to me. And on CP&I, sure, not a terrible idea by any means, but none of them make my heart skip a beat.
I think I was actually surprised at some of the reaction against FCC reform in that House bill. I think FCC reform could do a lot of good. It would probably have to happen on a statutory basis, but there was a transaction that was decided at a bureau level, and the end result of that is years have gone by and it's never been addressed by the full commission because of the procedural posture and rules that would prevent that kind of thing. Could be a good thing. I don't think it's a very good idea to be able to try to accomplish fundamental market changes on authority delegated to a bureau within an agency without the nominated commissioners getting a chance to pass on it. But the way the law currently exists, that can happen, and there's no time limit on when it needs to come up to the full commission for a review. And the courts generally, the D.C. Circuit has held, it doesn't review agency decisions until they're decided by the full commission. So, in essence, it gives the chairperson, whoever that may be, a lot of authority, and I think that's somewhat in tension with the point of having multiple commissioners. That's one example, but I was surprised at how much resistance there was toward doing something to try to reform the agencies. I think there's a lot of good that could happen there.
Gigi, what's wrong with the FCC and can it be fixed?
Well, so if there's a process reform bill, I think it has a chance. The problem with the bill from the last Congress was it wasn't just process. It also, it changed the public interest standard in a way that was very similar to DUC, and I think that's what made a lot of folks uncomfortable. So there's a lot of things that can happen. I agree with Fred wholeheartedly. There's way too much power vested in the chair. And I believe that if two other commissioners want to put something on the agenda, they should be able to do that. The one thing I liked about that bill is Sunshine Act reform, so that is, there's a prohibition against, was it more than two commissioners meeting at one time. I think there's a way to do that in a transparent way that makes sense. I mean, what happens is when you prohibit more than two commissioners from meeting at one time is the power is in the staff. So the staff makes all the decisions. So I think that needs to be changed. I think there needs to be more ALJs, and that would get you more to the sort of enforcement model that you're talking about and more actual fact-finding.
Administrative law judges.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Administrative law judges, the FCC has one, and he's about, 85 years old. I think that would get you much more back to sort of fact-based enforcement. And another thing that I've kind of gotten religion on is merger authority and merger review. I think it should be straight up or down. I think tons of conditions, they don't work because the agency doesn't enforce them, and, even if the agency enforces them, I don't think it works either. And I like what they do with AT&T, although the FCC actually never really decided AT&T. I hate what they do with Comcast. It should have either been, it's good for the public, it's bad for the public, but layering it with, 50 pages of obligations, 99% of them which are not, being enforced, is just a waste of everybody's
So I
time.
want to turn to questions from the audience, but Gigi, there's one provocative question, which is the Golden Bill. One of the things that you perhaps might refer to as something other than a process reform was the provision where it said that in merger review, the FCC would not have the authority to impose as a condition anything that it would not have the authority to impose as regulation. Is that not something that you would support?
Yeah, the problem, I would prefer, I think it's much better when rather than, crafting specific behavioral rules for, one transaction, they ought to do it industry-wide. So to the extent that is sort of me, yeah, we'd probably support that. But the bill had more than that.
Okay, well, I hope that there's a way that maybe there's a way to get some process reform through next Congress. I'd like to take questions. If anyone has any, please, when you get the mic, please make sure to identify yourself. If there aren't any questions, I have other questions. So
There's actually one thing I did forget is the revolving door is a major problem, and industry capture is a major problem. And I'd like to see some structural reform that will deal with that. And it's difficult, right? You can say if you go to the FCC, then for 5 years you can't. This is what Clinton originally had said. For 5 years after you can't lobby Congress or the agency. I understand the argument that keeps good people out, but I'm open to ideas of how else you can deal with the revolving door.
any ideas, Fred, Red?
I don't know about how to deal with the revolving door either.
Okay.
And I do think at a minimum, if somebody is looking at leaving the agency, they need to actually post publicly that they're doing so, okay? Then we wouldn't have had the Meredith Baker problem. There have been other instances of high-level officials. I had meetings with them on topics affecting the industry that they then left for, a month or 2 months later. So all they have to do is tell the general counsel that they're recused somehow or that they're doing this, but they don't actually have to tell the public. That actually would be small but significant.
Fair. Any questions from the audience? So let's, and then if there are no questions, then we'll just ask a few to wrap up here. I'd just like to hear from each of you what you would have the new chairman prioritize inside the agency, right? Again, I think regular order. I think routinizing and imposing some self-discipline, things like shot clocks, things like a degree of transparency about how things are being done and why they're being done. It sounds like small beer, but it would do a lot to, I think, just enhance the credibility of the agency. Fred?
I think focus on those few issues that we all started with. Some of them, in the case of incentive vouchers, are going to have to do anyway. And yes, I think more transparency is good, although it seems like we say that at the start of every chairmanship, and somehow, we have these discussions later.
Well, what's the breakdown? Is it that people grow in office? What happens? Why doesn't that commitment get
It's easier to be non-transparent, I just think. You're in the agency, but even from what I find, it's just easier to pick up the phone and talk to somebody you want to do a little favor. It's as bad, it's bad. It's as bad now as it was in the last term.
Well, and I was suggesting, when I said there may need to be some legislative requirements around process, that, if you don't have a timeline, it's easier to take your time. And, I was pointing out one particular specific type of procedural issue, but if you can do something at a bureau level and you don't have to submit it to a vote of your fellow commissioners and you're not sure you'll get them, oh, great, let's do it at that level, and then it never gets reviewed. These are, so those are the types of things that, I think are just not, ideally they'd be voluntarily resolved by whoever the chair is, but
On this point, I just came across a great quote from Alfred Kahn yesterday. Alfred Kahn, of course, deregulated transportation, but always said that his great regret in life was that he hadn't been there to abolish the FCC instead of the Surface Transportation Board and so on. And he said, a great liberal Democrat said, the dispensation of favors to a selected few is a political act and not a judicial one. And that was really at the core of his approach, to get back to Ray's concerns about the rule of law. Gigi,
so, as you said before, I think the switch to an all-IP network, it encompasses all the authority questions we've been talking about. I think that's really going to be the number one thing. But the thing that I would like to see the next chair do is actually have an agenda. Okay, say this is what I'm going to do and this is how I'm going to do it, as opposed to having industry dictate the agenda, or, the Congress did for a little while with the National Broadband Plan, but what happened with that plan? No, a heck of a lot. Very little of it has been implemented. I'd actually like to hear the chair say, this is what I believe in, this is what I plan to do, and this is how I'm going to do it. And it gives us something to judge that person by in the next 2 to 4 years.
So one final provocative question. So Alfred Kahn, did what people thought was impossible. It was actually taking down the entire regulatory regime. When the Progress and Freedom Foundation first started, it's one of its very early, if not its first papers, was proposing the abolition of the FCC. That idea seemed perhaps crankish in 1993, and yet in the last few years you've seen an array of people, from Larry Lessig on to others, actually say, we would be better off without the FCC. We're better off starting over. What do you think? Would we be better off with the FCC? Would we be better off with whatever problems exist in terms of market power and consumer protection? Is the FCC the right vehicle to address those?
It could be with the right reforms and the right leadership. Right now it's not, but I'm not ready to say blow the whole thing up. There are days where I do feel that way, but I think overall it takes a strong leader. I've been doing this for 25 years, and we've had some great chairs and we've had some lousy chairs, and it really has depended. So I'd say leadership and some serious process reforms are the things that are needed. I'm not ready to give up yet, although like I said, there are days that I am, but for the most part, no.
Well, I think it's also instructive and worth going back again to Alfred Kahn, Baron, which is, if you recall his recounting of what he intended to do at the Civil Aeronautics Board and what he ended up doing, there were two different things. And I hope I'm being fair to the history he wrote, but he went to the CAB not to shut it down, but to reform it. And he was going to bring the kind of economic rigor that he had as an academic to airline regulation, and he had just an A-list of minds with him and around him. And he said very soon, within a year after getting there, he realized it was unreformable. Not just the agency itself, but kind of the barnacles that had grown around it, which are called legacy airlines, and the way they did business. And it was only after being there that he decided, no, we have to put this out of business. We can't just reform it and make smarter regulation happen. I don't know if that's a universal lesson, but it's one I always... And yet the building you spent so much time working on would actually try to reform the FCC instead of, as Gigi has asked, instead of just transferring that jurisdiction to the FTC. So does that mean you think that it's not time to give up on the FCC yet? I'm with Gigi. Depends on the day.
There are certain elements of it that were actually also intertwined with international law. We don't usually think of spectrum this way, but there are elements of the ITU radio regulations that are binding treaties, and I've just realized that camera's probably not caught up anything I've said because I don't lean forward. But, there are elements that are bound by international law and the like. I've thought we should go to more of a property rights type regime for spectrum for a while. Congress hasn't shown a lot of interest in doing that. If you don't do that, then you probably need the FCC for that. This is a long-winded way of saying I think it's a complicated question. I think certain elements you could probably eliminate altogether, and other things you'd have to think long and hard about before doing that. So in the interim, maybe some procedural reform could be a big help.
Well, for my part, to close this out, I would simply refer you out of that quote line from The Great Gatsby about, it might be the case that the FCC goes bankrupt slowly and then all at once. It might be the case that some of these, that there begins a torrent of, or it seems like a trickle of small changes that end up leading eventually to some really fundamental reform. But as with any bankruptcy, it will see with time. So I want to please ask you all to give a hand to my panelists for coming today. We'll look forward to seeing all of you at future roundtables in the series, again on topics including competition, privacy, and public safety. So thank you for coming.